Ah, hello folks, J. Scott Phillips here, and today we are bound for deception and heartbreak with a look at Arthur Conan Doyle's second Sherlock Holmes short story, A Case of Identity, and it was first published in the September 1891 issue of the Strand Magazine. And then, as long as we're at it, we're going to take a look at some of the illustrations by premier Sherlock Holmes illustrator for the Strand Magazine, Sidney Paget. Now, this is an offering of mine to the now annual BookTube event, Holmes is Where the Heart Is, every February now, and it is to celebrate Sherlock Holmes. And there are 5 co-hosts that are bringing this event to us every year. I'm not one of them, but I will leave links to their announcement videos in the description down below. So if you are a Sherlock Holmes fan, and I perceive that you are, then be sure and check out their channels as well. Now, this is week 2 already of this year's Holmes is Where the Heart Is, and this week we are to be focusing on the short stories by Arthur Conan Doyle about Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson and their adventures. Now, I've already done 3 other videos for Holmes is Where the Heart Is between last year and this year, and so I will leave links to them down below because it might be helpful in context for this one, although I'll try to keep this self-contained here. But if you want to follow along with me, I've gone from the first 2 novels, the first short story, Scandal in Bohemia, which leads into this now, the second short story, A Case of Identity. And then we'll catch up from there. Now, I know what you're thinking already. You are thinking, well, wait a minute now. Isn't A Case of Identity the 3rd short story in the canon? It was definitely the 3rd one published after the July 1891 appearance of A Scandal in Bohemia, followed by the August 1891 adventure, The Red-Headed League, and the September issue then of 1891 was A Case of Identity. Or maybe you're recalling the table of contents from your old dog-eared, battered, Latakia-stained edition of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, which ran the stories in publication order. We'll explain all this shortly. It is simplicity itself. But first, let's catch up with Dr. Arthur Conan Doyle and what he was up to at the time he was writing A Case of Identity, just after A Scandal in Bohemia. On March 30th, 1891, Dr. Doyle had just arrived in London to start up his new ophthalmology practice and delivered the manuscript for A Scandal in Bohemia, which was intended to be the first in a series of short Sherlock Holmes stories, to his agent, A.P. What? And he had written the story while he was studying ophthalmology in Vienna to launch his new idea of writing this series of short stories about a central character for magazine publication, rather than writing another serialized novel. Today, we might call it a pilot episode for a TV series, but back then, this was a brand new idea that Doyle himself was innovating. And so things were starting to happen pretty quickly now. It didn't take very long for A.P. What? To sell A Scandal in Bohemia to the Strand Magazine, who was looking forward to the next 5 Sherlock Holmes short stories pretty quickly. And they were willing to pay Doyle £4 per 1,000 words, which was quite a bit more than Doyle was used to getting paid then. And so Doyle was excited. He got right to work writing the second Sherlock Holmes story then to meet that coming obligation, and that was A Case of Identity. And it didn't take him long to do that either. With less than 2 weeks, by April 11th, he had the manuscript done and was delivering it to A.P. What? Who then was exchanging that manuscript for the page proofs on A Scandal in Bohemia to Doyle. The Strand's editor, Greenhuff Smith, wanted Doyle to make some minor edits to make Holmes more understandable to his new readers that had not had the pleasure of reading The Sign of Four already. The Sign of Four was, of course, the novel, the Sherlock Holmes novel that had come out prior to any new short stories running in the Strand magazine. And Doyle didn't really want to be bothered with this, so he just kind of ignored the direction and took a shortcut and just edited out a few references that he had made to the Sign of the Four and let it go at that. Now, I guess I should mention that one of the innovations that Doyle had come up with when he was writing The Sign of the Four was to mention events and things that happened in the earlier novel, A Study in Scarlet. The idea being there that since Lippincott, who was publishing A Sign of the Four, had agreed to reprint an American edition of A Study in Scarlet and paid Doyle royalties for it. So he thought if he put references to the other book, then people that are reading A Sign of the Four now would say, hey, there's another earlier Sherlock Holmes story. Maybe I should buy that. And then he could kind of cross-sell each other's books. And then he would carry that over into the short stories as well, which is part of their charm, really, because it builds a continuity and a chronology. If you're reading about events that had happened in earlier stories that you have read, then you know that that Holmes and Watson live in this real fictional world, if that's even a term. But you know what I mean. So it builds a believable continuity, even though he tripped over that continuity quite often. But it was in there still, and you could refer from one story to the other without having to tell all those stories over again, kind of like I'm doing right now. But one of the intriguing things is sometimes he would mention events that happened before that were not chronicled in any other Sherlock Holmes story. So those are even more intriguing, really, I think, because now there are untold tales of Sherlock Holmes. But I'm kind of getting off the track here. Getting back to Doyle working on this, he took that shortcut and just chopped out those references because he wanted to get back to writing The Red-Headed League. That was the next story, and things were still happening really quickly here, and he delivered that manuscript to AP on April 20th. And in the meantime, had sold the idea of these serialized Sherlock Holmes short stories to Samuel McClure in America. And the timing of this was becoming important because in March, the Chase Act had been passed in the United States, which would enforce new copyright laws between the U.S. and other countries and would go into effect on July 1st, 1891. It's only April now. So took steps to make sure that none of Doyle's new Sherlock Holmes short stories would see print until July. And then that way he could get the proper royalties and copyright protections and all that if anything got out before then he would miss out on. Now, also around this time here in April 1891, Doyle's brand new ophthalmology practice in London was not really taking off like he had expected. But that's okay in a way because it gave him more time to write, and he was really able to crank out these short stories here for the Strand within about a week and a half or so in most cases. And he was actually getting ahead of schedule. He was able to deliver his fourth promised story, The Boscombe Valley Mystery, to by April 29th. And this was going to turn out to be kind of a stroke of luck in one way because no one knew it yet, but Doyle was going to become very ill for a while. And he would be unable to write the last two stories of the promised six for quite a while, till after he recovered. That's another story, but just know for now that the fact that they were pushing the print date to July now, that was buying a lot of time so that Doyle would be able to recover and write those last two stories without missing a beat, really, as far as the reading public goes. But that meant that after they published the first story in the July issue, Scandal in Bohemia, Smith had three other stories to pick and choose from now, and he preferred longer stories, and it turned out that The Red-Headed League, the third story that Doyle had written for the Strand, was a few pages longer than A Case of Identity, which was the second story written. So the Red-Headed League wound up running in the August issue, and the Case of Identity was running now in the September issue. And then when the first collection of Holmes stories would be printed in book form as The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes in 1892, the original Strand publication order would be preserved. So today in The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, when you're reading A Case of Identity, you will see a direct reference to the events of a scandal in Bohemia having happened some weeks before. And then when you read The Red-Headed League, you'll read that Mary Sutherland's Very Simple Problem was just the other day. And so you see, my good folks, that the proper order of the stories is simplicity itself. And now, having explained all of that, it's a little embarrassing to admit that it doesn't really matter at all. There are so many inconsistencies through all of the Sherlock Holmes stories. Things aside from dates and times, things like Holmes's pet bulldog, or Watson's various wives, when was he married and when was he not, not to mention his war injury. None of it really matters as far as the actual enjoyment of reading the stories for the fun that they are. And you can rest assured that Arthur Conan Doyle himself paid no attention to these kinds of details at all. He just wrote one story and then wrote another one and wrote another one and let them go. But now, speaking of this particular story here, A Case of Identity, let's get into talking about the story itself. It's pretty easy to imagine the original Sherlock Holmes stories as being pretty old-fashioned today. And we imagine Holmes's London as a world lit only by gas and powered only by steam. And that's true, but that was a modern world for its day. Holmes himself was a modern man, and so was Doyle. Doyle wrote and told modern stories. A Case of Identity seems antiquated to us today, but I maintain that it remains a modern story. Ostensibly, it's the case of someone who has disappeared on their wedding day. What happened to them? But to be fair, whom amongst us has not done the same exact thing? But the story itself is a modern story, a state-of-the-art story, in fact, of catfishing, if you think about it. Today, catfishing would happen online. Someone would create a fake identity and perpetrate it through emails or texts to somebody to scam them out of their money or to gain their trust for some reason, or whatever other purpose they might have in mind through this false identity, and not even being a real person. And if you think about it, the typewriter in Victorian days was the new device that was coming in that was not really quite understood, but it was being accepted little by little by the general public. It was much quicker to write on a typewriter once you learned the skills for it. And it was very practical for writers and journalists, that kind of thing. And then it was entering into the business world where documents and correspondence and things could be written and dashed off much quicker by those that had the skill to do that. And it was becoming one of the first means, practical means, of women to enter the general workforce. They could develop the skills and do this still considered to be somewhat a menial job of writing documents and things, preparing official papers and organizing those sorts of things. But there was still a little misunderstanding about the typewriter, because it was coming into a world where for centuries people were used to handwriting, and you know that you will recognize the handwriting of someone who you know well. Unmistakably, this particular individual wrote this particular piece of writing, very identifiable, as much as fingerprints might be. And so the typewriter was kind of a way of masking that. And if it wasn't then typewritten and then signed by hand, you would think it sounds like someone who you might know, but you don't know who actually wrote it. And being a mechanical means, anyone writing on a typewriter, that document would look pretty much the same as any other written message. And so that kind of sets up the story here for A Case of Identity. And I will, just before we get into the looking at the artwork here now, I should say that there are probably going to be spoilers ahead, because we're going to discuss the illustrations, which are illustrating the story and certain scenes and things. So we'll be talking about things that happen in the story. So if you haven't read it and you don't want any spoilers, turn the video off now, go read it. It's a fun read, and then come back and we'll talk about the illustrations. So now we're all set up. Let's get into the last section of the video here and talk about the artwork by Sidney Paget. Now, I'm going to back up for just a quick second here, because just like the Strand Magazine had Doyle go back and edit one of his stories in referring to stories that happened before, I'm going to do the same thing here with this video. We're going to be talking about Sidney Paget, the illustrator for the Holmes stories for the Strand Magazine. And I talk more about him personally and how he got the gig of illustrating the stories for the Strand in the video I did of Scandal in Bohemia. So I'll leave a link to that down below if you're interested in his background. But in the meantime, we will just proceed for now and talk about the illustrations for A Case of Identity. So here we go. This is the first of 7 Paget illustrations we're going to take a look at here for A Case of Identity. And here we see the page boy, who is not given a name in this story, but is probably Billy, who shows up later on in the canon. And here he's ushering in Miss Mary Sutherland, a rather large woman, into Holmes's room at 221B Baker Street. And upon seeing her, Holmes immediately asks her, do you not find that with your short sight, it is a little trying to do much typewriting? And, of course, she is astounded by his accuracy, as everyone is. But now we know that she is a typist and nearsighted, which is very important to the story here. And it comes out that she's living at home with her mother and her stepfather, Mr. Windibank. And she has some inheritance that she never touches, plus the money that she makes at the machine, she calls it, the typewriter. And as long as she lives at home with her parents, they have the use of the money until such time as she gets married someday and will move out. But she comes to Holmes today in a rushed hurry because her fiancé, a Mr. Hosmer Angel, has disappeared. Now, the illustration here itself is, I think, a really nice composition, typical of Sidney Paget. He always is careful to choose a specific scene from the manuscript and then put some effort into the accuracy. And here, the caption is a direct line from the story, but the description in the text is it kind of shows a little of the humor that Doyle will give us from time to time. And it says, the boy in buttons entered to announce Miss Mary Sutherland, while the lady herself loomed behind his small black figure like a full-sailed merchantman behind a tiny pilot boat. And I think even without the illustration, you kind of get the idea here. But the composition is nice. It directs the eye in such a way that we know that Holmes is in his own element here, while the doorway frames Miss Sutherland's stoutness nicely, and that echoes Doyle's merchantman comparison. So very nice. And of course, we see Paget's brother, Walter Paget, standing there with his fingers steepled. Brother Walter was Paget's model for Holmes in the early illustrations. And then down below, we see Sidney Paget's usual signature, SP, as well as the engraver's signature, in this case, W and S, which shows up in a lot of other Strand engravings of the day. Now, these next couple illustrations are kind of flashback scenes from Miss Sutherland's case as she's describing it to Holmes. We see her dancing here with a gentleman that she met at the gasfitter's ball, who introduced himself as Mr. Hosmer Angel. Now, before all this, Miss Sutherland's stepfather had made it clear that he did not approve of her stepping out to such events, especially this particular ball, because he did not approve of the type of people that attended it. But Windibank, her stepfather, had said that he was going out of town to Bordeaux on business at the time, so there was nothing to stop her from going. He wasn't in town to say nay. And, of course, Miss Sutherland becomes enamored with Mr. Angel, and while stepdad was still out of town, they stepped out a couple of times to go on walks together. And that's all it took for her to fall in love with this guy and consented to marry him. Oh, those Victorians. But after that, stepdad came home from France, and Mr. Angel could not come by the house anymore. So instead, he wrote letters to her every day, and these letters were typewritten, which she would answer, but the only address that she had for him was a general post office box in Leadenhall Street. And this continued for a while, the two of them only getting together when stepdad was away on business. And then they could see each other in person, and Miss Sutherland was falling deeper and deeper in love all the time. And so they decided that the next time that Mr. Windibank would be out of town, they would get married. And that leads us up to the next illustration. This is still a flashback from Miss Sutherland telling Holmes her case here, but this is on the morning of the wedding, and Mr. Angel had come to Mary's house to pick her and her mother up. Mom was in on it, and he had arrived in a hansom cab, and I guess since Mary was a rather large woman, and I assume so was Mom, he put the two of them together in one cab, and then he hopped into another cab to meet them at the church. But before they leave the house, he makes Mary swear that whatever happens, she will forever and always be true to him. And then, as we see in the illustration here, when Mr. Angel's cab arrives at the church and the cabman hops down to open the door, the cab is empty. So now Mary Sutherland has stated her case to Holmes, and Paget gives us this really nice head-to-toe portrait of Miss Mary Sutherland. The case does have one or two points that interest Holmes, so he agrees to look into the matter for her, and so she leaves a bundle of 4 of the typewritten letters from Mr. Angel for Holmes to help him in his investigation. These letters are important because Holmes suspicions that because they have been typed, including the signature, and they're always from a general post office address, they were meant to be untraceable to any specific person. Now, most people would think that anything written on a typewriter, a particular model of a typewriter, is going to look exactly the same as written on another typewriter of that make and brand and model. But Holmes knows that every individual typewriter has its own little quirks and idiosyncrasies, that a certain character might have a little scratch on it or something, or the counter might be plugged up with ink, or one letter might type a little higher or lower than the others, or the spacing might be off. Whatever it is going to be unique to that individual typewriter and thereby traceable to that specific typewriter, just as identifiable as, again, as fingerprints might be. And that brings us to the next illustration here, which is a classic. It's Holmes in his element, and could really be from almost any Holmes adventure, but in this particular case, Watson has just arrived at Baker Street to find Holmes kind of half asleep next to an array of bottles and flasks, and there is the scent of hydrochloric acid in the air. And we assume that Holmes has been conducting some tests on this particular case of identity, but no, the chemical experiment is just a diversion to satisfy some point of curiosity. He's already kind of solved in his own mind that there never really was a mystery to Miss Sutherland's case. He'd seen a lot of cases like this, and this was just one more, and was pretty much simplicity itself. He just needed to find out some specifics. And then we may scan down here a little bit towards the bottom to see that there is another engraver who has signed the work here. And in this case, it is the signature of Swains, who is another engraver that shows up quite often in the old Strand magazines in those days. Now, these next two illustrations, the last two, I'm going to put up together so you can compare them side by side, because something that you don't see too often back in those days, but they're depicting the same scene, and they're almost like two frames out of a little movie clip. It's kind of interesting. Now, these two illustrations appeared a page apart from each other in the original printing of A Case of Identity in the Strand Magazine, but it's the scene where Holmes has lured our villain of the story to the rooms at Baker Street to confront him, and then also to give the reader kind of the explanation behind all of Holmes's reasoning here. And the bad guy is confident in facing Holmes because he knows that he has broken no laws. There's no law on the books to cover a case like this, and so the police cannot touch him. But Holmes, here we get to see a little of the humor that Doyle would put into the Holmes stories from time to time. Holmes acknowledges that this is true, but he says that there has never been a man that deserved punishment more. And so he reaches over towards a writing crop nearby and picks it up. And he says to the villain, "It is not part of my duties to my client, but..." And then he gets a hold of that writing crop, and then we just see the bad guy just bolt out of the door as fast as he can. I will let you read the story for yourself to find out who the culprit actually is, and why he was catfishing poor old Miss Sutherland. But there you have it, folks. So I hope you're enjoying Holmes is Where the Heart Is. Very appropriate event title when considering A Case of Identity here. But if you are looking to read the story yourself and you don't have a copy, it's probably most easily found in The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And there are tons of reprints out there. I don't think it's ever been out of print all these years. But if you are going to read it and you want to read the entire Adventures of Sherlock Holmes and you want to read them in order that they were written, be sure to, after A Scandal in Bohemia, that you skip to A Case of Identity and then back to The Red-Headed League. Not that it matters, it's just a trifle, but then, of course, life is made of trifles, isn't it? Well, blast it all anyway. I almost forgot to mention that just like in my earlier Holmes is Where the Heart Is videos, I am displaying my Sherlockian nerdiness again, and I created a Google map pinpointing all the locations described in A Case of Identity. So if you'd like to have a little extracurricular fun and run around Victorian London with Holmes and myself, then I'll leave a link down below, and you can join us if you like. And sorry about that, folks. Now, back to the video. Now, this is still early in the week 2 of Holmes is Where the Heart Is, so if I have time, and if you're good, I'll try to do another one of these videos, and that would be the Red-Headed League. So, in the meantime, get back to reading something that you're enjoying, and be good, and thanks a lot.